Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into the Sabaton history for Long Live the King. I'm working on a whole bunch of stuff to try to get out in the next couple of days. A couple more Sabaton songs, the first movie reaction. I have the, another part of the Hannibal series, I believe. But there's a bunch of stuff coming. If you're waiting on one of these videos in particular, bear with me a little bit. I'm trying to hustle and get through it as quickly as I can. But we're going to start today with Sabaton History's Long Live the King. Let's get into it.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Joachim from Sabaton.
This is Sabaton History. Karl den Tolfte, known popularly as Carolus Rex, was killed by a stray bullet in battle, like pretty much anyone else in war at that time. Who fired that bullet? Well, there's a lot of speculation about that.
And our song, Long Live the King, is about that day and his funeral march home.
The military disaster for Sweden that was the Battle of Poltava on June 28, 1709, was a crippling wound that put the whole future of Sweden in jeopardy. The Swedish King Karl XII had barely escaped being captured by the victorious Russians and was now having his wounds tended as a guest of the Ottoman Empire at the city of Bender in what is now Moldova. Although he was safe among the Ottomans, Russia's great enemy, he was now also over 700 miles away from his realm, halfway across Europe. That in itself was maybe more damaging to the Swedish Empire than any Poltava could have been. With the absence of their ruler, the Swedish parliament in Stockholm, the Riksdag, was in a precarious situation. The destruction of the Swedish army at Poltava had encouraged the old enemies of Sweden to renew hostilities. Not only the Russians, but Saxony and Denmark as well set their sights on the now struggling Swedish Baltic Empire. The Riksdag did its best to negotiate some sort of peace with its enemies to buy time for the king's return. Karl, however, forbade any further peace negotiations. He believed that he had once brought the empire glory and prestige, and he would do so once again in the future.
Yeah, this is kind of the trait, at least from my perspective, this is the trait that makes him incredibly special, but it's a double-edged sword. It's also probably the trait that hurts him the most, and that's his personality and mindset of like victory through any means. It's like total victory mindset. Nothing else will do. And like I said, it's a good thing in a lot of circumstances, and obviously, as you know, even circumstances earlier in his kingship, but it's a double-edged sword.
He also was taking his own sweet time about returning to Sweden. Without a peace deal, Riga and Dunamunda were soon lost, as were Reval and other Swedish possessions and fortresses in the Baltic states. In November 1709, an army of 16,000 Danes crossed Öresund to attack Sweden itself. Sweden fortunately had on its side the highly capable Governor-General of Skåne, Magnus Stenbock, who not only put together an army of mostly young recruits for the defense of the Swedish homeland, but also used that army to counterattack and drive the Danes out of Sweden. But this could not go on forever. Many felt that Sweden needed a strong statesman, a level-headed sovereign who could assess the nation's real strength and the limits of its power. But it was still an absolute monarchy by constitution, and whatever the Riksdag decided, their decisions could still be overruled weeks or months later as King Karl's orders finally arrived from his self-proclaimed exile. The situation was indeed dire. Sweden was bleeding dry. Its economy, which was mostly agrarian, was in shambles. The people were starving, carrying the burden of a besieged empire on their overtaxed backs. Famine and bankruptcy crippled the realm. Soldiers could not be raised because there was no equipment for them. Ships could not be repaired. Cannons could not be cast. There were mortgages on towns and estates, and even the church bells had to be sold just to keep the Swedish state and its defenses alive. Stenbock's victory brought them breathing room, though. And there was even a chance of a neutrality pact, backed by the Holy Roman Emperor, who wanted to prevent the war from spreading into his realms. The Riksdag supported the idea, but Karl would hear nothing of it. In fact, he hated the idea of a neutrality pact, thinking that this would ultimately tie his hands and keep him from reconquering the lands that were rightfully his. Sweden's future, he believed, was destined for greatness, and Karl would not be the king under whose rule the Baltic Empire fell. Putting his trust in God and the righteousness of his cause, the king tore the neutrality pact apart and made it perfectly clear to the Riksdag that the authority of the empire and its armies lay with him and him alone. He still aimed to save everything, to renew the offensive against Russia and Sweden's other enemies. There would be peace eventually, but a peace honorable for Sweden.
Who shall we now turn to when our leaders lost their heart? Lives are lost, but at what cost will the grand dream fall apart?
Even the hardcore loyalists in the Riksdag wrote heartfelt letters to their sovereign explaining the impossibility of his demands.
Yeah, and everybody's already in a terrible situation, right? And so, I mean, I can understand the thought process of, please just let us get back to some sort of level footing before we go on any other crazy major offensives or anything like that. Like, domestic policy has to be taken care of. And, you know, there are, it's not specific to one monarch or even one country or anything like that. History is full of leaders who were good or great, even really great at half of it. They were great at foreign policy or they were great at domestic policy. They're the list of leaders who were great at both is a lot smaller historically. You know, it's two totally different realms. You're doing two totally different things. It's almost like you need a separate person and personality to do the one that the leader isn't good at. And like I said, there are some who were good at both, but but that's a lot more rare.
And that the age of conquering and triumphs was over. Sweden had to come to terms with her enemies, even if it meant giving up territory, or there may well come a day when there was no realm for the king to come home to anymore. Stenbock even went to Bender himself to plead with the king in person, but it was useless. Historians agreed that up until 1712, Sweden still had a few chances left to save parts of the realm through clever diplomacy. Yep. There was an offer by the Prussian King Frederick I for Karl to lead a combined army from Prussia, Sweden, and Saxony against the Russians. But even that offer was refused by Karl, not wanting to.
And that's the ace that you have. That's the ace that everybody has here, is that, you know, Russia is the thorn in the side of everybody. And everybody feels like they have an opportunity to capture territory and to kind of knock Russia down a peg. That is the wild card in this that could have been played, and it could have, you know, it would have benefited, at least in theory, it would have benefited all of the major powers involved.
To be a puppet for others. The Swedish king was deeply disillusioned by decades of broken promises and betrayals by the other great powers. Instead, he clung to a belief in his personal destiny and a God-given mission that was his from birth. However, in an age of ruthless Staatsräson, putting the security of the state, whatever the form of government, first, by any means necessary, that was a tragedy in itself. In 1713, Magnus Stenbock and 11,000 men were forced to capitulate to an overwhelming force of a Russian, Danish, Saxon coalition. Sweden had now lost all influence in the courts of Europe. A fatalistic mood swept over the Riksdag as the continental positions were basically lost, And at this point, even they were pretty much ready to revolt against Karl and the absolutist constitution if it meant saving Sweden from disaster.
And I did some digging. I'll get into it more in the video tomorrow just because I'm in a bit of a hurry today. But I did some digging on the idea that, well, that Karl XII could have been shot by somebody, on his own side. And this is basically where it comes from. This is basically where the idea comes from. And there's been a lot of interesting stuff done. Somebody commented on it, that there were actually DNA tests done. I had also seen that. It's an interesting thing. I'm still looking at a couple of different ideas, theories, research methods. So I'm hoping to have that all kind of wrapped up tomorrow. But this is where it stems from.
Liberal statesmen like Arvid Horn stepped in, pleading for a parliamentary future instead of facing the dangers of a revolution. But this liberal future could only begin after Karl was no more. In the face of this possible revolt, Karl finally came home to Sweden. Despite the burdens he had put on his people, the common folk still praised their beloved king in the hope that now everything would finally turn out for the better. However, the king had no intentions of remaining in Sweden. Instead, he immediately ordered an army of 20,000 men raised and prepared to continue to make war. Talks of peace or neutrality must cease at once. He would take the fight to the enemy, which was by now a coalition of Denmark, Russia, Prussia, Poland, Saxony, and Hanover, because why not Hanover too? With his typical confidence, unshakable belief in God, and a little money from the French, Karl set out to save Sweden by a demonstration of power, but one that it could hardly afford.
For the honor, for the glory, for the men of fought and bled. A soldier from Sweden remembers the dead.
Great triumphs were not easily to be found, and instead there were just more years of fruitless campaigning. In late 1718, Karl and his troops marched towards Danish strongholds in southern Norway. It was already past October, and his troops suffered from the harsh weather and the hardships of the journey. Hundreds were dying of disease as the siege of the fortress at Fredriksten at Fredrikshald began. The king himself did not shy away from danger, though, and shared the burden of his troops. He slept in the field with them, kept watch in the trenches, and even led his troops into the breach of the outer walls. By November 30th, the Swedish trenches had been dug up to the final bastion of the fortress. And just a musket shot away, the king and his officers inspected the battlefield by night. The Danish defenders constantly lit up the night, trying to pick off sappers. Again and again, Karl was seen climbing the trenches to look over the edge for any sign of activity inside the bastion, to the dismay of his concerned officers. Musket balls and cannonballs have little respect for a king, one of them said, as the king once more put his head over the top. Suddenly, a thud was heard as if a stone were hitting the earth. The king's head sunk down on his chest. "Lord Jesus, the king is shot!" the officers cried out from the trenches. A piece of metal had pierced Karl's left temple, punching through his head and coming out the other side. The king was dead in an instant at 36 years of age, and his reign of 21 years came to an end. And with the king's death, so too did the constant wars finally come to an end. The king's body was brought back to Sweden, to a nation that had suffered dearly under the costs of war. With his death, the dreams of the great Swedish Empire vanished, but peace finally returned to the Swedish people. Who or what exactly had killed the king that day is still a mystery. Some suspected a canister shot from the fortress walls. Others presumed a musket shot. Some said he was shot on purpose by one of his own by mistake or treachery. There was an investigation, and several liberal politicians were even tried and executed, but hard evidence for an assassination has never been discovered. To this day, over 300 years later, the mystery remains. The mummified body of Karl XII has been exhumed and analyzed 3 times since his death, the third in 1917. But there is no answer to the question of who or what killed the king.
Rooted
obviously that makes a lot more sense though. With all of the turmoil, with the parliament, with the people in Sweden, with the domestic policy situation in Sweden, that theory getting floated out there makes more sense, to me at least.
Okay, now this is going back a lot further than most Sabaton songs, right?
Yes, we're talking about the Swedish Empire in those days.
Yeah.
And this song is quite different in that sense that it was actually the one that inspired us to do the album Karl XII in Swedish, actually.
So this was the first one that you...
Yeah, I mean, when starting to write the music, I remember it so clearly. I had this idea of this painting, the Funeral March, I think it's called.
Oh yeah, I know the painting. No, funny thing, when I first moved to Sweden and you could take Swedish classes through the government, like the first or second day of it, they started telling us a little Swedish history. We learned about this painting literally the first or second day there in school. So that's what inspired you for this song.
Yes, I had that picture in the mind, in my mind when I was writing the main riff, and that sort of became the main chorus of the song. And for some, natural reasons, though the words that came out of my head were Swedish, so I sang the chorus in Swedish on the pre-production. And
I talked about this with the actual song, but the chorus is done really well. It flows really well. It's catchy, right? So that's interesting that was kind of the part that they got and then worked around that. And then also I've talked about how Joachim sounds, I don't know if I want to say better, because his English is great, but for some reason the Swedish resonates more with me. I feel like he does the Swedish really, really well.
Then we listened to it, and everybody's like, "Oh, that's awesome! Let's do the whole album in Swedish," and that seemed like a great idea.
It was a great idea.
Yeah, until you had realized you had to write the lyrics twice, and you have to record with all the choirs and everything in time planned for only doing it in one language.
Right.
Jeez.
You were not quite as big then as you are now.
No, and let's just say there was tumultuous times regarding everything from the recording to, we switched band members, quite a few at that time as well. So I don't remember that recording very fondly, and that's usually a good sign.
but it turned out to be great, because it is cool that you did the whole album you did in both languages, as it turned out. Now, question though, when, as you said, this was the first song, and you were inspired by the painting and write this. Was it already planned to do a whole album about Swedish history, or was it just,
No, we actually had the plan. Let's do something about the Swedish Empire in those 100 years. And I just had to start somewhere, and that painting came into my mind, and that's the way it went, I guess.
Now, did you learn a lot of this in school when you were a kid? I mean, did they teach a lot of Swedish history to young Swedes, or did they when you were younger?
Obviously, this is a big part of the Swedish, education system in history. Every nation has its own history.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that too, about how all of you in Sweden were taught this history of the empire, right? Because I wonder this a lot about like the British Empire. Do they teach the rise and fall of the British Empire, or do they just teach the rise of the empire? Like I'm very you guys let me know. I'm curious how that's taught.
And that's one of the things I love about traveling and touring, because, things that are so, obvious to all Swedes are unheard of in, let's say, Brazil, and vice versa. So,
yeah, because then think of the things you do, right? Smoking snakes and Last Dying Breath, and Panzerkampf. I mean, these all mean a lot to different...
Oh, yeah, and it's sometimes thanks to...
That's been one of the coolest parts about the channel. I talked about this in one of the comments in the last couple of days. That's been one of the coolest parts about this channel, is there's so much information. There's history that even if I know it, there's so much context and culture and different things that played into it or led up to it that I had no idea about. No idea. Because you're not taught that, and if you don't live there, how would you know? And that's been one of the coolest parts about having this channel, is having all of the people. I've had comments from people from Germany and Poland and Sweden, and giving context and information and familial ties, and it's really, really awesome. Like, I can't explain how much I love it.
Some of you guys, fans who have been giving us books and sending us emails, a good, I'd say probably 30, 40, 50% of some albums, especially Coat of Arms and Heroes, were inspired by you guys. So
That's really
thanks.
cool. So keep sending them in. All right, well, that is it for Long Live the King, but we will see you next time on Sabaton History.
And that's it for today.
Back to the fatherland, count it all as
Okay, so that was Long Live the King, Sabaton History for Swedish King Karl XII. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.